The golden sun reflected off the Chicago River as Martha Hughes sat in the back of a black car heading toward the towering skyscraper that bore her late husband's name, but she knew the name really belonged to her because she was the one who had stayed up until 4 in the morning for 30 years calculating the margins while her husband Arthur took the handshakes, and the glory today was the day her children intended to strip her of that legacy. As the car pulled up to the curb, Martha adjusted the heavy silk scarf around her neck and felt the weight of the secret she had been carrying for 6 months. She entered the lobby of Hughes International and watched as the young security guards barely looked up from their phones to acknowledge her. She was just the old woman in the floral dress who occasionally brought donuts for the staff, and to them she was as relevant as a rotary phone in a 5G world. Martha walked toward the executive elevators and felt a familiar sting of rejection when she saw her son Julian standing there with his wife Tiffany. They didn't even stop their conversation as she approached, as if she were a ghost haunting her own hallways. Julian looked at his watch and sighed with a dramatic flair that he had perfected during his MBA years at Harvard, and told her that she was late for the very meeting that would decide her fate, while Tiffany adjusted her designer sunglasses and patted Martha's hand with a condescending pity that made Martha's skin crawl. Tiffany whispered that everything was going to be fine and that the doctors at the new facility they had chosen were the best in the country for people with fading memories. Martha simply smiled a vacuous, gentle smile and followed them into the wood-paneled boardroom where the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and betrayal. The board members were already seated around the massive mahogany table, and most of them looked away when Martha entered because they had been bought and paid for by Julian's promises of higher dividends. Once the old guard was finally cleared out, Julian took his seat at the head of the table and began a rehearsed speech about the need for agility in the modern market and the heartbreaking reality of his mother's declining mental health. As he spoke, he pointed to a PowerPoint presentation that highlighted Martha's supposed lapses in judgment, including her refusal to sell the family's original warehouse, which Julian claimed was a sentimental anchor dragging down their profits. Martha sat at the far end of the table and watched her son's mouth move, but she wasn't listening to his lies. Instead, she was thinking about the small office she had rented in secret on the south side of the city under the name of a holding company that no one in this room could possibly track back to her. She thought about the nights she had spent with her attorney Carlos reviewing Julian's disastrous forays into the cryptocurrency markets and his illegal use of company funds to cover his personal gambling debts, which totaled more than $50 million. Tiffany sat behind Julian like a predatory bird and occasionally chimed in with observations about Martha's behavior at home, claiming that Martha had forgotten the names of her own grandchildren and that she had been found wandering the garden at night in a state of confusion. The board members nodded with fake solemnity, and one of them finally asked Martha if she had anything to say in her defense before they moved to the formal vote to remove her from the board and appoint Julian as the sole conservator of her estate. Martha stood up slowly, making sure to lean heavily on the table to play into their expectations of her frailty. She looked at Julian and saw the glint of victory in his eyes, and then she looked at the board members and saw their cowardice. She reached into her vintage leather handbag and pulled out a sleek silver laptop that looked far too modern for the persona she had been projecting. She plugged it into the boardroom's high-tech display system, and the screen went black for a moment before a series of complex financial spreadsheets appeared. The silence in the room became deafening as Martha's voice suddenly transformed from the soft quaver of a grandmother to the sharp resonance of a commanding officer. She told the board that she had spent the last 40 years being the silent partner in this firm, and that while her husband was the face of the company, she was the architect of its survival. She explained that she had been monitoring Julian's incompetence for 3 years and that she had anticipated his move to oust her long before he even had the courage to try. Julian jumped to his feet and shouted that this was an unauthorized intrusion and that Martha was clearly having a manic episode, but Martha didn't flinch. She hit a key on her laptop and the screen changed to show the ownership structure of a company called MH Strategic Holdings. She revealed that over the last quarter, this holding company had systematically purchased 90% of the firm's outstanding debt from the banks that Julian had defaulted on, and that as of 9 o'clock this morning, she was no longer just a board member, but the primary creditor of Hughes International. Tiffany's face turned a sickly shade of gray as she realized the lifestyle she had built on Martha's back was about to evaporate, and Julian sank back into his chair looking like a deflated balloon. Martha continued her presentation by showing proof of Julian's embezzlement and the secret accounts he had set up in the Cayman Islands to hide company profits from the IRS. She told the board members that if they voted to remove her today, she would immediately call in the debts and bankrupt every single one of them, but if they stayed and listened, she had a new plan for the company. The board members who had been nodding along to Julian's speech minutes ago were now leaning forward with a desperate hunger to stay on Martha's good side. They began to shout over one another to distance themselves from Julian's plan, and Martha silenced them with a single look. She turned to Julian and told him that his tenure as CEO was over and that he was being demoted to a junior analyst position where he would be required to work 60 hours a week under her direct supervision, so he could finally learn the value of the money he had so casually wasted. As for Tiffany, Martha suggested that she find a productive hobby that didn't involve spending Martha's hard-earned money, and informed her that the lease on their luxury penthouse, which was owned by a subsidiary of the firm, would be terminated by the end of the week. Martha watched as her son and his wife realized that the senile woman they had tried to bury was actually the only person keeping them out of prison. She closed her laptop and stood tall, her eyes bright with a fire that had been suppressed for far too long. The meeting adjourned in a flurry of panicked whispers, and Julian tried to approach Martha with tears in his eyes, begging for a second chance, but Martha walked past him without a word. She stepped out onto the balcony of the penthouse office and looked out over the Chicago skyline, feeling the wind against her face. For the first time in years, she wasn't just a mother or a widow or a silent partner. She was the owner of her own life and the master of the empire she had built in the shadows. The silent partner was silent no more. Martha took a deep breath of the cool city air and felt a profound sense of peace, because she knew that justice wasn't just about winning, it was about reclaiming the truth. She looked at the Silver Oaks brochure that Tiffany had left on the table and tossed it into the trash can with a satisfied smile. She knew that her golden years were not going to be spent in a nursing home, but in the boardroom where she belonged. She picked up her phone and called Carlos to tell him that the first phase of their plan was complete, and that it was time to start the real work of rebuilding the Hughes legacy into something that actually stood for integrity. The elevator ride down was different this time because the staff had already heard the news through the corporate grapevine, and as Martha walked through the lobby, the same security guards who had ignored her earlier now stood up and held the doors open with a newfound respect. She stepped out into the sunlight and decided to walk home, instead of taking the car, enjoying the feeling of the pavement beneath her feet and the sound of the city she loved. She was 75 years old, and she had never felt more alive or more powerful in her entire life. When she reached her home, she found Joseph waiting for her on the porch with a bottle of champagne, and he didn't need to ask how it went because he could see the victory in her stride. They sat together and toasted to the future of a company that would finally be run by someone who cared about the people as much as the profits. Martha looked at the photos of Arthur on the mantel and whispered that she had finally finished what they started together. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she wasn't walking it in anyone's shadow. The silent partner had finally stepped into the light, and she was never going back into the darkness again. Martha spent the rest of the evening planning the restructuring of the firm, and she felt a surge of energy that made her feel decades younger. She knew that Julian would try to fight her, but she also knew that he didn't have the stomach for a real battle, especially when his mother held all the cards. She was ready for whatever came next, because she had spent her whole life preparing for this moment of total independence, and as she watched the city lights flicker to life, she realized that the greatest luxury in the world wasn't money or power, but the freedom to be exactly who you were meant to be all along, and for Martha Hughes, that meant being the boss. In the weeks that followed, Martha completely transformed the culture of Hughes International by firing the corrupt board members and promoting the hardworking employees who had been ignored by Julian for years. She became a mentor to young women in the industry and used her wealth to fund education programs across the city. She never spoke to Tiffany again, and Julian eventually grew to respect his mother's strength, though he remained in the basement office for a long time. Martha's name became synonymous with a new kind of corporate leadership, one that was quiet but unbreakable, and she lived the rest of her days knowing that her silence had been her greatest weapon, and her final victory was her greatest masterpiece.